I am Mel Mobley, and I am joined today by composer Anthony Green. We are excited to have a chat about composition and maybe life in general. So welcome, Anthony. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm doing great. So for those of our audience who don't know, I thought it would be nice for you to say a few words about yourself. You list yourself usually as composer, performer, social justice artist. So I know you've done this a million times, but once again, maybe just say a few words about what it means to be a social justice artist.
Definitely. Well, I think for artists who consider social justice artistry a part of their practice, that means completely different things for those artists. For me, it means being aware of certain situations that need a greater story and need a bigger presence in general social conversations and political conversations and artistic conversations. So I feel as though my role as a social justice artist is to advocate for these stories and to try to use my platform, whatever that may be, to bring these stories and these situations a little bit more attention.
Okay, great. So I know that you started off as a pianist primarily. Is that correct?
Definitely, yeah.
From an interview I saw, I think you said that you really didn't get into composition until you were in undergrad college there in Boston. So how then did you morph into pushing your focus all towards composing around this idea of social justice?
So when I was younger, pre-college, I was so fascinated by making things. I hardly read fiction books. I was always reading nonfiction how-to books. I remember ordering a sign language phrase book and cookbooks, and I learned how to knit and crochet when I was in elementary school. I did origami, did macrame. I loved magic tricks. I took clay classes. I was always making things. So when I started piano, I started playing by ear when I was 5. And throughout that time growing up, I would make up melodies and I would compose some pieces. I remember going to chamber music camp and working with some of my friends, asking them, how do you write for strings? Can a string play 2 notes at once? And I wrote some pieces for my friends to play, and nobody heard my pieces and said, you know what, Anthony, you can study that, because they all wanted me to be a pianist. All of the people are older than me, and my teachers just thought that I would naturally be a pianist. So I started my undergrad as a pianist, and then I showed some of my pieces to a fellow undergraduate composition major, and he told me, you should think about double majoring. So I started double majoring the next year, and then I just dropped the piano major because I knew that my home was in composition. And some of those first pieces that I composed as a beginning undergraduate composition major at Boston University, the first one was about death in the war in Iraq, and the second one was about the very first World Trade Center bombing. So both of these pieces had a social justice aspect to it. It was really quite natural for me to compose these pieces, and I never gave much thought about the differentiation between people who
Right.
compose music like this and people who don't. But it wasn't really until 2017 that I publicly put social justice artist in my professional identity and on my website.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting because I'm always interested in like people's history and how that, turns into what they create. So given that, you talked about, your history and training up until college was primarily as a pianist. So your music is extremely varied. Obviously, there's a wide array of sounds that happen. But so I'm fascinated with what your musical experiences were that contributed to that. So like whether it was what you were studying or how you were trained or what you were listening to.
That's a really excellent question. I remember as a child once watching, I want to say Sesame Street. that I heard a string quartet play something extremely gnarly. And I always say, when I think back on it, it was probably a Bartok string quartet, but I was too young and not enough in the classical music world to have asked my mom who the string quartet was and what piece was being played. I just remember as a child seeing these four string players playing this extremely crazy, wild music, and I just thought, this is so cool. Oh my gosh. So when I started taking piano lessons, my first piano teacher, who is such an incredible woman, Susan Kelly, she at one point in her career took a class with Darius Milhaud, and she introduced me to music theory and to contemporary music and was telling me about electronic music and all sorts of things.
Wow.
And I'm sitting there as a middle school student and as a high school student thinking, this is so cool. Ah. And then she was the one that said, you know what? You have the talent to go to Apple Hill. So that very first year I went to Apple Hill, I was assigned to play this piece called Lady Chatterley's Dream by John Deke. I was 16. It's a piece of very contemporary music by a
Right.
living composer. John Deke is the bassist for the New York Phil, but also just a fantastic composer. And this particular piece included speaking and playing piano at the same time. And
Uh-huh.
I had this gnarly cadenza where I was playing these octaves, and I had to pretend to be an invalid who wasn't getting sex from his wife, right? So it was just this crazy experience. That was my first real new music experience proper. So another aspect of my life was just growing up and organically loving contemporary music and experimental sounds and everything. At the same time, my mom listened to easy listening, my dad listened to Motown, my brother listened to rap and gangster rap and R&B. My mom also took me and my brother to church every Sunday, so I was exposed to gospel and all sorts of different gospel. From the
Right.
musicians in church, I was exposed to blues and jazz. And then my friends were mostly white and Jewish. So I was listening to alternative rock and punk and
Right.
some Jewish traditional songs as well. And I played piano for the musical theater. And I studied Beethoven, Chopin, Bach, all of that with my piano teacher. And I
Right.
loved everything. That was the thing. I just loved all of it. So
Well, I think that probably is partly why your music has that eclectic, very wide variety. Well, I didn't mean to ask this, but since you mentioned you talked about your childhood and your experiences with new music, I've noticed in kind of looking at your stuff online that you've done some collaborations and a lot of work with students like younger than college and even smaller childs, like your opera project in Kansas, and there was something recently, a virtual presentation online that had students playing. So when you work with kids with new music, like, do you think about the aesthetic or the techniques or dumbing it down in any way or gearing it towards them in any way to give them a different experience?
So when it comes to working with student performers, I'm always acutely aware of ability. And that is also true when it comes to writing a piece for older people, right? I'm
Right.
always acutely aware of ability. So in thinking about writing a piece specifically for one person or a group of people, that whole approach does not change regardless of age. Regardless of prompt, so the opera that you were talking about, which won the Zepic Modern Opera Prize at for Opera Kansas, that prompt was to compose a piece that could be taken into schools with a wide range of ages that focused on teaching some element of science, technology, engineering, art, and math, STEAM. So that was the prompt. And I remember being fascinated by the history of the kaleidoscope. So I wrote this opera about the history and the development of the kaleidoscope, which went down really well with the folks at Opera Kansas. And
Right.
they've performed it at least 15 or 16 times now, probably more. It's incredible how often they performed the piece, and I'm so grateful for them. And but there was this instance where my friend Annabelle Ibanez was working with some students who really wanted to do something experimental. So I wrote them a text-based piece that was improvisatory. And I did the same thing, well, a similar thing when I had my McKnight Fellowship in Minneapolis. I wrote this piece called String Meditation that focused on extended techniques and introducing those extended techniques within this context of slow, meditative, sonic environments. And those children took to it extremely well. So it's
Wow.
for me, it's all about ability and prompt.
Okay, well, and that's interesting. As you mentioned, when you're writing, you're thinking about the audience that will receive it, I assume. So when you are, most of your music is centered around social justice. So there is a subject content that obviously you were trying to get across. How specific is your idea of what you want an audience to perceive or what you want them to get out of it as you write it? Do you have a, like, is it a very narrow, I want them to think about this one thing, or is it a little more open?
When I am writing social justice pieces, it all depends on the subject. Sometimes I want to end the piece a little bit more open so that the audience can put in their own experience and ask themselves the tough questions or try to answer the tough questions that I'm posing within the piece. And then there are other times where the piece is just about awareness. And when a piece is just about awareness, then there's really no need to, I don't want to say to challenge the audiences, but there's no need to to pry into the audience's consciousness. You know, those pieces that are more about awareness is just to have a conversation with the audience and tell whoever is listening, this is a problem and we should be aware of this problem. And if it's in your capacity to do something, even if that something is to share either this piece or an Instagram infographic about this situation, just be aware that this problem is going on. And if you can do something about it, then you should.
So when you think about the audience, obviously, and in my experience has been, if you know you're writing a piece for a specific thing, then you know who the audience, you know characteristics about that audience, like their education in terms of music, etc. So do you do you ever think about that with your musical language when you're writing? Do you think, okay, well, like obviously with the opera, about the Kaleidoscope, it's a fairly tonal opera and more, you know, typical melodic lines. So do you ever think about that when you're writing and say, okay, well, this is only going to be accessible by a certain audience, and have concerns about that, since your message is like a fairly broad message that needs to kind of be heard by everybody? Does that make sense to my question?
Yes, it does. And I want to say that I always try to approach my music in a way that can be enjoyed at least by everyone, regardless of education, exposure, or age. So
Mm-hmm.
even for the Kaleidoscope opera, there's a subtitle that says it's an opera for children, young and old, right? I think even though the music and the text is quite geared towards children, I also feel like the story is so fascinating that if an adult were to experience this opera, they would also get something out of it.
Sure.
And that has been the general comment by adults. In fact, some adults, there's this one section of the opera where I go through these mathematical equations and I say that when you take a slice that is a triangle of this degree, then it's going to create this shape because of this mathematical equation. And some of the adults came up to me and they said, you know what, I never really thought about that. And you just explained it so clearly. So thank you. I can now to my children. So I'm always trying to make the experience enjoyable, at least for a wide range of people. And nowadays, especially post COVID, or I guess, during COVID, because we're not really post-COVID right
Right.
now. But we're experiencing this moments of digital premieres and digital performances. So we don't know really who's going to be watching this stuff. We can definitely share our links and our Zoom links with our network, but we don't know who in our network is going to share with other
Right.
people. So it's even more important just to make sure you're putting out a quality product so that regardless of who's watching it, they can say this is a quality piece or a quality production.
Right. Well, you mentioned the COVID situation, and I guess at this point it's worth like exploring that a little bit, because I think it certainly has affected the way we all produce music, think about music. I was thinking just yesterday about how your music is so visceral and so like immediate, or at least a lot of it, especially the ones with movement or with a lot of vocal production. And I wonder, like a lot of them, I was going, I wish I could be there and be in the room with that. So, how do you think, because obviously this shift to digital production, I think is going to be with us permanently in some version. So what in what ways do you see that as being a good thing, and what ways do you see that as being maybe a bad thing?
So I think it's a good thing mostly because we humans have this stubborn tenacity to continue and to find a way to do what we want to do regardless, right? And that's
Right.
great. So I remember the first time I attended a Zoom concert. It was at the end of this workshop that I gave for some students at a university in Oslo, Norway. I
Hmm.
was supposed to be there, and I was so sad that I couldn't
Right.
go. I've never been to Norway before, and I really wanted to experience that, go see some Edvard Munch in a museum, and visit the
Yeah.
fjords, but
Hmm.
I'll have to wait until it's safer to do so. But then, while I was experiencing this concert, which, by the way, the students who made the pieces were mostly visual artists, and so the pieces that they created were a wonderful mixture of sound and visual art. And I was thinking to myself, you know what, this is not ideal, but because these visual artists were working on a different platform, they approached these pieces knowing what the platform was. And they
Right.
created things that were actually quite unique to this type of exchange. And then
Sure.
I thought, okay, I can't approach these digital concerts in the same way I would approach going to a concert hall and seeing an ensemble on a stage, etc. I
Right.
have to change my approach to this. And because of that, I've now changed my approach to creating digital content. So September 12th will be the digital premiere with new gallery concert series of a piece that I recorded this morning called Caress. In fact, the music is on the piano right now. I didn't take it off. And I'm super excited to present this because I created a version that could be performed live. But what I'm doing for the digital premiere has all sorts of extraneous videotapes and
Right.
close-ups, so I'm really just making a music video out of it.
Right. I have seen a lot of that. I think everybody's getting a little bit better at video production and
Yeah.
post-production editing. So as you continue to work, and I mentioned that a lot of your work has this very visceral quality to it, but I wanted to talk about the actual compositional elements. So when you compose, you mentioned to me in an email that you don't like to be narrowed down to one technique, that you like to have more openness about what you can do when you compose. So what kind of overarching processes do you use, if any?
There are quite a few different approaches that I take when I compose. I always say to people that each piece has its own different approach because each of my pieces I view as my children, basically.
Right.
And so, for instance, if I'm composing social justice pieces, I always start with research, even if I'm intimately familiar with what I'm about to compose or
Hmm.
with the subject matter that I'm about to use. I still like to make sure I have my, for lack of a better term, my I's dotted and my T's crossed.
Right.
I don't want to get anything wrong. And I also
Right.
like doing the research just to make sure there's something that I'm not forgetting.
Hmm.
So, but outside of the social justice pieces, I have some groups of works that belong in the series. So I have these pieces called Kaleidoscope, spelled COLLIDE-oscope. And
Hmm.
the whole idea of these pieces is to take musical gestures, very short musical gestures or musical ideas, and create a very limited palette for each instrument and have those ideas swirl and clash and collide against each other, similar to the way shards and materials collide against each other within a kaleidoscope to create multiple different shapes and forms and images. And so that's the overarching idea behind those pieces. I always start with a schematic that I then use to create those pieces. And then I also have a series of vocal pieces that set American texts. So I have a piece that sets the Gettysburg Address. I have a setting of the Bill of Rights with the preamble of the Constitution
Oh,
and the
yeah.
first two paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence. I also have a piece that sets the questions on the test to become a United States citizen. And so those pieces, they float between social justice artistry and standard composition.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about standard composition, another thing that you mentioned to me is that, and I bring this up because my students will definitely have to watch this. So you said you very, very strongly believe in counterpoint or a firm grounding in counterpoint. Can you talk about that, the role of counterpoint in your music?
Oh my gosh. Well,
And just even
I,
just a little bit
yeah, yeah, yeah,
for my
yeah.
students, please.
I might be giving away a secret here, but I don't mind. I really like doing this. So I'm going to talk about this in general because I think we as composers sometimes, when we're studying and we're in academia and we're taking these classes, we have such a tendency to focus on the minute details of things. What is a 7 half diminished 6/5 as it relates to this external key area? How do we consider the concept of tertiary dominance, and all of these things? We have such a focus on the narrow. And when it comes to counterpoint, yeah, so what is first species counterpoint and how can we create an example of triple invertible counterpoint? This is, I'm concerned with those things up until a certain extent. I do feel like we as composers should know how to do these things. But when it comes to counterpoint, let's zoom out and let's
Mhm.
see what counterpoint is. It's a system that creates balance, that creates clarity, and that helps composers communicate what is in individual voices. And when
Right.
we put these voices together, it helps us as composers create something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And this is the role of counterpoint for me. And you can apply these lessons using the minute detail of counterpoint and then zoom out, find your own voice, find the material that you're working with, and then apply those greater meta principles of counterpoint to your material.
Okay, that was a perfect answer for me. So thank you for that. Actually, um, as we continue to talk about the way in which you approach composition, um, I'm also very interested. You use the voice a lot, and you use it in a lot of different ways. So there's a lot of things I'm sure you could say about it. I, First of all, you use it sometimes with text, just as other composers use it with text, but then sometimes you just use vocal sounds. So first, I guess, why do you use the voice so much? What is it that connects you with that or connects that to what you're trying to do in your music? And then how do you go about approaching maybe a non-textual use of the voice and a textual use of the voice?
Yes, the voice for me, it is such a personal entity. I wrote this paper, I gave this lecture presentation called The Black Psyche and the Voice. And this was for a conference in Istanbul. And the overall thesis of this paper is that Black people in the United States have been oppressed in so many different ways. When Black people were stolen from Africa and brought to the United States, they were stripped of their language, stripped of their last names, stripped of their instruments. So basically, what they had left was it was their voice, you know? And this idea for me, I think, has perpetuated the Black psyche from the times of enslavement to the present. Black people have this different relationship with their voice. And I wasn't necessarily fully conscious of this until I started that journey. It really started with me and my friend Ashley Gordon co-founding Castle of Our Skins in 2013. This is a Boston-based concert and education series, and our mission is that we're dedicated to celebrating Black artistry through music. And both of us knew that in order to be a part of this organization and to develop this mission, we had to do our research about our own history, about history of Black people who are composers and artists, and what is going on sociopolitically in the present, right? So that organization really was the beginning of my personal journey into realizing this relationship between Black people and the voice. And as soon as that was fully intimated within myself, that freed me up to use the voice in all sorts of ways. So when I'm approaching voice using text, I still use those lessons that my composition teachers told me. Always think about text setting, the relationship between spoken rhythm versus sung rhythm, registers and vowelizations in different registers of the voice, the different characteristics and personalities of vocal fox. So a tenor has a different attitude and character than a lyric soprano or a coloratura, for instance. All of those, I guess, more detail-oriented aspects of writing for the voice I keep within me when I write for voice. But then I also think about the structure of the text that I'm using. When I was in high school, for instance, I loved studying meter, and I was obsessed with writing sonnets, Elizabethan sonnets, not Petrarchian sonnets. So I wrote about 80 some odd sonnets. I actually wrote 100 sonnets because Shakespeare wrote about 100 sonnets, and I said, well, if he could do it, then I could do it. That was my whole reasoning. But in that process, I was learning about meter, so iambic pentameter, trochaic, quadrameter, all of this stuff, anapes, spondies, dactyls, trochees, all of this stuff. And till this day, when I go to set a text, I will analyze the rhythmic scheme and try to find metric feet within the text. And that helps me with the rhythmic clarity when I go to set the actual text. So I'm not only approaching it as a composer, but also, I would say, as a literary person, or at least a wannabe literary person.
Well, when you do use text that's legible or that's understandable, so when you're composing a piece and there's a subject matter, then how do you have a different approach between a piece with text and a piece without?
Yeah.
You know, if the subject matter, it has to do with a certain element of social justice, there's got to be, I would think, a different approach if you've got words that are helping you push that subject matter versus no words.
Definitely, definitely. The pieces that I have that don't have text or that use text more as sonic units or to create sonic textures. I'm thinking more about the overall emotional goal of the piece. So, for instance, I have this piece called BA4, and this piece is a rather, how should I say this? It's a piece that infuses scientific elements with musical elements. So my partner is an MRI physicist, and so he works a lot with the brain. And I was asking him about the part of the brain that is responsible for all movement. And he said, yeah, that's the Brodmann area 4 of the brain. And so I started doing research about this aspect of the brain, and I asked him all sorts of questions. And I used proportions and numbers that are related to the body to create this sonic vocal exploration of these kind of heady principles
Right.
of communication between the brain and the body. And it's interesting when you're doing research about this area of the brain. So the right side controls the left and the left side controls the right.
Right.
And then what fascinated me the most is that the signals get generated before we move. So essentially, our brains are always um, behind our bodies. Like our brains are in a relative past compared to our physical present,
Right.
which then got me to think about time in a whole different way, which is why in this particular piece, I have a rather loose concept of time and duration and how the piece unfolds. There's also an optional dancer with this piece that is the physical representation of these voices creating signals. So the voices then create the signals for this dancer to move, etc. And it's this really avant-garde, more abstract expression of this relationship. But then I have this piece called Empathy One, Diamond Reynolds. And while there is a very specific text to this piece, it's you shot him, um, sorry, you shot 4 bullets into him, sir, which is what Diamond Reynolds said after a police officer shot her late um, boyfriend, her late partner, Philando Castile, right?
Right.
So within this piece, I was trying to encapsulate the psychological depth of this moment and what was going on both physically and emotionally, and how that physical and emotional and mental and spiritual response all exploded within that moment, but how Diamond Reynolds kept it within herself and had that strength to keep it within herself, right? So this particular piece is an explosion of that particular situation. And it's quite difficult to understand the text. But in this piece, the clarity of the text is secondary to the emotional goal of the piece. And it creates more of this sonic texture that should pierce the psyche.
Interesting. So you mentioned also in that answer working with a dancer, and we haven't really touched a whole lot on your idea of your performance. I mean, consider yourself, I think, a performance artist as well. So which just kind of broadens the idea of what a performance is, I think. So I've noticed in a lot of your pieces there is movement, specific movement required, sometimes with an actual dancer, sometimes just for musical performers to make certain motions. So how did that evolve into your work? And when you're doing that, how specific are you with the requirements of the types of movement?
Yeah. I think this evolved mostly because of my love and appreciation for visual art. I remember just falling in love with the paintings of Rene Magritte when I was in middle school, taking this visual art class, and then growing up and falling in love with Basquiat um, and Betty Sars. I remember going to this exhibit in the Tate Modern in London and coming across some pieces by Betty Sars and just thinking, oh my gosh, this is everything that I've ever wanted in visual art. And then I've been really fortunate to have attended residencies that had writers and visual artists and dancers and other creatives as well, sometimes composers. I met some theater artists, some clown practitioners. And so being exposed to visual artists as friends as well as colleagues, I think inspired me to not only explore performance art within myself, but also to create these pieces that have very strong visual experiences. Sometimes when I'm thinking about Spotify and Pandora culture and how people download these 3-minute songs, and we've lost this practice from, at least when I was a child, getting a CD and opening up the booklet and appreciating the CD art and reading the lyrics and then putting the CD within
Right.
the player or the cassette or the vinyl within the player and just having these experiences, right? Many people today just download music and they listen to it on the go, and
Right.
it's not as much of a ritual as it was in the past. Not saying that younger people today don't have their own types of rituals, but it's a very different experience. And so I'm constantly thinking about this shift and thinking about how the concert hall experience should also be a little bit more demanding, right? Because we can definitely, I can be a pianist, I can go on stage and perform a piece of Beethoven, and that's fine. But I can also be a pianist, go on stage, perform a piece of Beethoven in front of a projected video that I've commissioned one of my video art friends to make that might pair really well with this. And then I could have a spoken word artist come and recite a beautiful lyric uh, that was created by a living poet about Beethoven's relationship with the present, and make that concert experience much more fascinating and much more demanding of its audience, something that you can't just listen to on Spotify, but you have to be there physically. So I really now am just more concerned about creating these pieces that are just much better experienced physically than just on headphones.
Right. So I know that you, so you say, I know you do a lot of collaborations and you're often performing in your performance art pieces. I was curious whether in any of your work with dancers, whether you've been choreographed by them. Have they ever, do you ever let them guide the movement?
Definitely, yes. I worked with a fascinating choreographer, performance artist, amazing woman, Jimena Bermejo. And she, at one point, we had this piece called "The Wall Has Already Been Built,"
Yes. Yes.
and this was a collaborative piece where I created the soundtrack and she created the physical movements. And at one point, we were improvising with each other, and she just made all of these incredible suggestions. And we had these blocks that she had gathered, so we were building this wall and tearing it down, and we used all of these physical movements that are loaded physical movements as well to create that symbolism. The backstory behind this piece is that uh, the 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 performance was planned before the 2016 election to happen after the 2016 election. So depending on what happened, the piece would change.
Oh, how
And
interesting.
yeah, we created the idea of the piece before the election, and then the crap hit the fan, and changed the ending of the piece essentially for this performance. Yeah, it wasn't the most optimistic thing, but I'm glad that we did it, and I'm really thankful for working with her.
Yeah, I know that I've worked with in that same situation with a dancer who is choreographing movement, and it's interesting. They can put you out of your comfort zone fairly quickly, or at least in my case, and it's quite a growth experience. Which I think it seems to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of your pieces are about growth, just not just for the audience, but for yourself as well. You talk a lot about research and how you want to get more into the subject matter. So do you see composition uh, as that as part of the process, growth, not just for whoever's going to receive it, but also for the creator themselves?
Definitely. I think education is what leads to growth and awareness and action. And without that aspect of the composition process, then I feel I'm just putting ink on a piece of paper. And I always want to do more than that. Even in my non social justice oriented pieces, I am constantly trying to explore and to figure out different avenues of composition and and sound creation and sound exploration, and also trying to push the boundaries of my performers themselves when I'm creating a piece specifically for an ensemble or for a soloist. I'm always asking these questions. Have you ever done this with your instrument? Or have you ever done that? How would this sound if you do this? And it's this learning process between the two of us, because I can
Right.
always take lessons that I learned from those very specific moments and apply them to these future pieces. So yeah, I'm always trying to develop and grow.
Well, so I think that we're about out of time, but I wanted to ask, like, before we shut down, I mean, we're in a very unique time. I mean, we've had not only this COVID, but also certainly here in America, we've had the social unrest after the George Floyd. So there's been like this huge focus, I think, now on people actually beginning to realize and understand lack of access, inequality, and kind of systematic obstacles to things. So when you look at the field of composition, what do you see as the challenges for increasing inclusion? I mean, I think that certainly we see a lot of underrepresented groups in the field of classic composition today. And where do you see that heading? What do you see as the challenges, and how to approach those challenges?
Yeah. The biggest challenge is that we have this 600, 700, 800, 900 plus year history of practice of practically ignoring these issues, right? And every time these issues were brought up, there was a little bit of a wave and then it died. And then there was another wave and then it died. And there have been some wonderful people doing amazing work, wonderful articles written, books written, conversations happening, and ensembles being created and then dismantled again. And at least up until this point, nothing has quite seemed to stick. So, what I'm very optimistic about now is that these conversations and these ensembles and these ideas and these principles and these philosophies, it seems like they're sticking much more than they ever have in the past. I could be wrong. Time could prove me wrong, unfortunately, but I am quite optimistic. Right now, as you can imagine, I've been asked to do some panels about anti-racism in new music, and many of my fellow panelists have then said to the panelists, to the producers, you should think about having this same discussion 10 months from now, because this is how we keep up the momentum, right? Castle
Right,
of Our yeah, Castle of Our Skins, we started in 2013, so we've been doing this for 7 years, right?
right.
And it seems like it's just been this year where we've been boosted uh, into this greater realm of public awareness. And we're really grateful for that, because now that we have had this increase in awareness, we've had 7 years of programming to back us up. So
Right.
people can come up to us and they say, who are some of the composers that you love? So just go on our website. We have 7 years of programming. All of our seasons are on our website. We have a resource page that has links to things like Afroclassical, Sphinx Organization, Harlem Chamber Players, all sorts of resources, music by Black composers, individual artists. We love Ed Bland, we love Renee Baker, we love Jessica Mays, we love all of these different composers, Natalie Joachim, right? So we're constantly doing the work. And I feel like when people do this work and when the resources are out there, it makes it easier for other people to find this stuff.
I would say that's definitely true. I mean, certainly as an organization, I think, speaking of a person who runs an organization, you know, I think what happened to a lot of people is as these conversations began to happen, everybody actually began to look inward and saying, what have I not done to help this perpetual situation where there is this lack of access or lack of awareness of Black artists and in classical music. And so I think that a lot of artists, I'm sure you've been reached out to a ton over the last 3 months or something. And I certainly appreciate you spending time with us. But anyway, I do think that there is reason for optimism. I hope so. I think all of us hope so.
Yeah.
But I think that's one reason that I wanted to talk to you today and put this out as part of our festival. And one reason I really wanted to talk about your music, because at the heart of it, for me, that's what attracts me to what you do, is I love your music, you know? And so hopefully we will have your links listed below the, you know, the interview and on our webpage. So hopefully a lot more people will discover what you're doing, because I think it's wonderful. And so anyway, thank you for being with us, and we wish you the best of luck in the coming year, and hopefully sometime in the future we will cross paths again.